you're in Madrid at the moment. Tell us what you're doing in Madrid.
So we're doing Peter Grimes by Benjamin Britten. And I'm doing a role, Ned Keane, who's not a particularly nice man. He's quite sleazy and a bit of a womanizer and a wheeler and dealer. They call him the Quack. He sort of sells laudanum to old ladies with heart problems and things like that. And in this production, I'm sort of dressed up as in a tracksuit and a cap, a bit of a drug dealer in this production. And then I've got, I think, do they call it a bum bag or something, like the American tourists normally wear to put their wallets? And I've got one of those where I've got my stash of little bags with white pills in them that I sort of hand out sneakily behind my back to people and collect money for.
I like the way you pretend you don't know what one of those things are.
Yeah.
So in a few moments, Jacques, we're going to see a little clip of you from YouTube of you performing Billy in the opera Billy Butt. Do you remember that time when you were in Glyndebourne doing that?
Yeah, very much. It was sort of it was by a long shot my biggest engagement at that time, and because it was such a Billy Butt. Benjamin Britten is I mean, one of Britain's great composers. So anytime you do a work by him in Britain, it's a big deal, and there's a lot of pressure on it, and there's sort of a very high standard and good tradition of it being done in the country, and Billy Butt in particular. It's a role that not many baritons get to sing. It's a sort of a very coveted role. So to have been able to do it at such a young age at a very important venue like Glyndebourne was scary, but also a great time to get through that.
Let's hear now Jacques Imbrailo at Glyndebourne singing Billy. Let's go right back to the beginning. Before you discovered the West End and before Glyndebourne, you grew up in South Africa. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I grew up initially in a very small farm town in South Africa, and later on we moved to the farm as a kid as well. But it was very much. I always think it's probably comparable to about 1960s in the UK. We were always about 20 years behind with everything in South Africa in terms of social structures and things like that. But we very much had the roam of the land. We on holidays, after breakfast, you take your bike and you say goodbye to your mom, and you'd be cycling all over town with your friends, and you'd be back in time for supper time.
All that changed when a traveling choir came to town. Now, tell us what was involved then.
Yes, so in South Africa, there's a choir called the Drakensberg Boys Choir, and within the choir circles, they're sort of well known worldwide, but in South Africa, obviously very well known. And they came to do a concert in our little farm town, and it was quite a big event, and most of the school kids went to the concert, and we were a bunch of boys sitting in a row, all Afrikaans. It was a very sort of Afrikaans area of the country, and spoke just about no English at that time. And the conductor of the choir was quite an imposing English-speaking man. And in the interval, he said there'll be auditions for boys between the ages of 9 and 12, and I was 10 at that time, and we sort of cheekily sort of dared each other as a joke to go that way. We'll go and just make a joke of it. At the end, I was I was an annoyingly obedient child, so sort of breaking the rules or doing anything disrespectful came quite hard to me. Although I was sort of game to go and have a bit of fun at the front. But then when the conductor after the concert turned around and said, "Right, who's here for the auditions?" the other kids ran away, and I, as being too obedient, just stood and didn't move. And the conductor just asked me to sing played a few notes on the piano and asked me to sing them, and then asked what's your schoolwork like? Are your marks all right? And they were at that time. And so he said, "You're in." And my dad was asleep at home. He didn't come to the concert. I went home and sort of shook him awake and said, "Dad, I got a place in the school. Can I go?" And he sort of drowsily said yes. And I held him to it the next morning, and a couple of weekends later, we drove down to the school, which was in the middle of the Drakensberg in South Africa. Beautiful scenery. We arrived down at the rugby field. There was zebra running around, and the kids were kicking a rugby ball, and there's a river right next to it, and boys were riding on horses. So it just seemed like the perfect place to grow up.
Now, let's fast forward a few years beyond your school years and tell us how you made the step into the Royal Opera House.
Yeah, so after this boys' choir school, I sort of thought that's me done with singing. I've done that, and I went to a normal school. And then ended up studying law in South Africa, and I slowly but surely started taking singing lessons again as a hobby. And I wasn't very committed to the law studies. I didn't particularly enjoy it, and so when I finished that, my singing teacher encouraged me to do a proper music degree, which I then did, and auditioned at the Royal College in London, and got a scholarship. And so I came to London to study at the Royal College. And then at the end of that, was a 3-year course. And at the end of that, I auditioned for the Young Artist Program at the Royal Opera House, which is a bit like doing articles or a training contract at a law firm, where we get paid a small salary and we sing small roles, and but we still receive training.
Going back to your career, some of the things you've done within the singing world, tell us about some of the things you got up to in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, so I climbed on the Billy Butt there was my sort of my big break. That was and it's been a really good vehicle for my career up to now. I've done quite a few different very good productions. I've been very fortunate in working with really good directors on Billy, which is quite a special piece. And then I've sung at Covent Garden a few times, doing various roles as well, and then across Europe and America. And next year I'm making my Metropolitan Opera House debut, and later this year my Paris National Opera debut.
Now, you just say singing at Covent Garden, but when you say singing at Covent Garden, you mean at the Royal Opera House. I mean, what's that like? What's it like to stand on the stage there and sing?
It is incredible. It's a wonderful theatre with wonderful history. It sort of feels a bit like it's my home theatre, because I was a young artist there, and so when you go back, it's a great feeling, because you sort of feel I'm back home. It's also quite intimidating, because when you left, you were a young artist, and now you come back as a guest artist singing a title role. So you sort of feel a bit of pressure. If I've got to prove that I'm good enough now, it's not just because I used to be a young artist. So it's a strange feeling, but it's one of the kind houses in the world. There's a very good atmosphere. People, their music staff, the administration staff are all very kind and positive. So it's a great house to work at.
Now, there've been some challenges along the way. You and I were discussing some of this stuff before, and you told me about some of the inevitable medical setbacks that happen, injuries that happen to musicians along the way. Tell us, how have the last 12 months particularly affected you?
So I had my vocal injury about 2 years ago, and I had to stop singing for about 6 months and sort of build my voice back up. But the problem hadn't completely disappeared. It was still there. I was still singing basically with an injury, managing it. And just before lockdown, the January, February before lockdown, due to certain circumstances, the injury had sort of flourished up again, and my vocal cords had started bleeding again at the point where the injury was. And then all of a sudden, all the work disappeared, and for everything from March until December was cancelled due to COVID, which was for Cara and I very stressful. It was most of our income for the year was gone, and there was I was supposed to have the operation to fix the injury, which kept on being postponed because of COVID. So it wasn't an easy time, but in the end, it did mean in some ways that we had the time to actually get the operation done, which I did in September, and it went really well. I have a fantastic ENT who sort of generally looks after me. Who I go to every now and then, and he did the operation and did a wonderful job. And my voice is now fine again. It's absolutely fine again, which is great. So it's been a tough year not having any work, but we're on the way up now.
It's really good to hear. So Jacques, we'll go back to asking you a few questions about those early years in terms of what you made of the Christian faith. You told me earlier that you had become a Christian really at a young age, at the age of 6. What did you understand about the gospel, about Jesus in those days?
Yeah. I mean, at a very simple level, I understood that Jesus died on the cross for us, and if we believe in him, we are saved from our sins. I sort of had a childlike understanding of what sin was, and that we that we all do things, and that there's a problem there, and that Jesus' death on the cross solves that, and he saves us. The questioning came later on in my life as a teenager and things, but I sort of always approached it from, I know this is true. Why? How does it make sense now? How can I answer the difficult questions within that framework?
And through those sort of teenage years, those early years that you're referring to, I think you saw lots of people who also professed a faith, but led quite a, to use your term, a hypocritical life. What do you mean by that, and what did you make of that?
Yeah, I think in South Africa, certainly growing up, and that's in the time that I grew up, most people, certainly in the Afrikaans communities, certainly 90-95% of people were nominally Christian, and going to church on a Sunday was just what every family did. And I can't remember any of my friends basically not going to church on a Sunday. That's just what you did, and everybody, certainly if they would have been asked, would have said, yes, I'm a Christian. So that was a very nominal thing. We were just basically a Christian community, but it didn't. The hypocritical side of it comes in that is that it was quite often not reflected in how people acted, how they treated each other, and how they went about their daily lives. And part of that was the fact that people just assumed, well, because I belong to this community, I'm Christian, rather than actual deep understanding, and that there's a problem between us and God, and that needs to be solved somehow, and that happens through Jesus on the cross. Now,
when you came to London, you were part of a church in central London. I think that's where you and I first met, actually, wasn't it, in that church? And I think that the minister there came up to you one day and said something very helpful. What was it that was said that you found so helpful?
The reason he'd come up to me is because I hadn't come to church for about 3, 4, 5 months. At that stage, I started at college living hypocritically a life which didn't reflect my faith, and was starting to do things and starting to enjoy things which wasn't part of who I was supposed to be, and was certainly not reflective of what I believed. And the guilt of that made me feel less and less deserving of, ironically, of being a Christian, and to the point that I sort of stopped going to church because I thought I don't belong there anymore, because I'm not living like a Christian should be living. The minister there came up to me and said, well, it's nice to see you again. Where have you been? And I said to him basically what I said now. And he said, don't be silly, go and read Luke 15 and then come back to me. And Luke 15 is the story of the prodigal son, who has all the blessings and in the world, and then sort of leaves his dad and goes and squanders all of that for a different life, and then comes back and with nothing in his hands, and his father accepts him with open hands. And it was just the fact that I realized that it's not about deserving to be saved, because nobody deserves it, and that we really bring nothing. I brought nothing to the table. It's all grace and it's all God that does the saving, and that was just it was inspiring and freeing at the same time. It just lifted that weight of guilt that I wasn't good enough to come to church, and it lifted all that and made me realize, well, I don't bring anything, and it's grace and it's mercy, and that's just wonderful. It was just a wonderful thing to realize, even though I had known it before. That just really drove it home.
Really interesting that you pick up on both grace and mercy. Grace and mercy mean, of course, that anybody can qualify for heaven. What would you say to somebody who just said, well, I don't think I could ever get into heaven?
Well, exactly that there is no qualification. Our qualification is Christ, and he offers it to us without us being able to qualify for it. There's no we can never qualify. If it was a matter of being good enough, or having to qualify, or having to be part of a social structure, none of us would be able to be saved. It is all God who does the saving, who comes to us and says, here it is, regardless of who you are, what your background is, and what your life has been like. God offers it to us through a tremendous and love that we can't explain, and that is grace and mercy.
Jacques, in just a few moments, we're going to go to the next part of our evening, which is a talk entitled Heaven's Surprising Guest List. Before we do that, just one final question. I understand that as a baritone like you, your best years are still ahead of you, unless I've misunderstood. You know, sometimes people moving into their early 50s, that's when the real sort of glory years are to come. Is that right? And what happens after that?
Yes, the baritone voice. Well, most male voices only mature a little bit later on, but especially the lower bass and baritone voices. Your best years is really in your 50s, when the voice is at its strongest, if you've been singing healthy. So, I mean, hopefully, in terms of singing, my best years is still ahead of me. But then, at some point that is going to end, and at some point my life's going to end, and I'm going to be facing God. And I suppose what I have to bear in mind as I work on my career and things, am I ready to face that? Is that what my decisions that I make, and how I conduct myself, and what my priorities are? Does that reflect the fact that at any time I could be standing in front of God and having to answer, and what happens then? And I suppose that is more important for me to look forward to in my life than the glory years of my voice potentially.
What would you say to somebody looking in who is a little bit interested with the musical side of what they've heard this evening, but a bit suspicious or skeptical about any relevance in the Christian faith?
If you're suspicious of it, of anything, you have to look deeper into it and find out the facts. There's no point of making your mind up before you've really looked into it. And I would say look into the character of Jesus and who he is and what he said and how that impacts your life and why that should be relevant.
Thank you very much indeed, Jacques Imbrailo, for joining us this evening. Thank you for being interviewed.
You're welcome.
Good. Well, it is a real pleasure to be with you this evening and dealing with this question, Heaven's Surprising Guest List. Our subject this evening, therefore, concerns us all. Will we or won't we make the cut for heaven? Now, towards the end of the interview with Jacques, I asked him about his future. He said this: hopefully the best years of my singing are still ahead of me. But at some point that's going to end. At some point my life is going to end and I'll be facing God. Fast forward with me, if you will, to that time, that day. Picture the scene. Our publicity that you may have seen advertising the event tonight tried to capture this. We're standing at the gates of heaven. And just imagine for a moment you're there. And to your huge disappointment, there's a queue. So you take your place in the queue. It's a fast moving one, you're pleased. And Jesus is the doorkeeper. He has the guest list, some sort of high-tech iPad sort of version. Now, it will be your turn in a moment, but first you watch what happens to the people ahead of you, in particular, the person ahead of you, somebody you recognize. You don't know him personally, but you've heard a little bit about him. Stories you've heard are all good ones. He has that sort of reputation for being just a really good bloke. He's one of those sort of religious types, law-abiding, polite, passionate about charitable works and philanthropy and everything environmental, of course. He's respected and respectable, a family man, kind and caring, a regular member of his church. He's been christened and confirmed and community focused. Jesus looks at him with all of that and he shakes his head. No, I'm sorry, you're not coming in. And now it's your turn. You're next. What does Jesus say to you? Well, to help us prepare for that moment, I'm going to read a short story from Luke's Gospel that I was saying a little bit about a moment ago. A parable, in fact, that Jesus spoke to a crowd. Jesus explains that when it comes to getting into heaven, there will be some surprising decisions. So I'm going to read from Luke chapter 18. And I'm just going to read a few verses. I think it's going to pop up on the screen for us to look at. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves, that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other one. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, that little parable that Jesus spoke, it's mainly about two characters. A Pharisee, that was one of the religious elite, a highly respected member of society. People thought very highly of Pharisees, and the Pharisees thought very highly of themselves. Also, a tax collector, not respected very much, probably Jewish, but he would, of course, collected taxes for the Romans, and he would have had a reputation for dishonesty. I'm sure you appreciate the shock of the story, because it's the bad tax collector and not the good Pharisee who makes the cut for heaven. We'll come back to the verdict shortly. Let's work through the story first. A few of the details that I want to draw your attention to, a few surprises along the way. Here's the first surprise, the false assurance of the crowd. I'm just going to read verse 9 again. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Now, immediately before Jesus had been speaking this parable, he had been speaking to his disciples. And now it's though he sort of directs his attention to a slightly different group of people, no longer the disciples, but rather a group of individuals, people, we're told, who trusted in themselves. Now, that sounds awfully like a group of Pharisees. They may well have been respected, but they were well known as people who trusted themselves. That's an important detail as we start our little parable today. One of the two main characters of the story was just like the crowd to whom Jesus was speaking. And so as a reader, this is the first surprise. This parable is spoken to us. It should function as a wake-up call to warn some people who think that they're going to heaven, that they aren't. And I guess that could be any one of us, couldn't it? I mean, in Jesus' day, if you asked a Pharisee if they would made the cut for heaven, they would have said, of course. Who do you think I am? Of course I make the cut. I mean, in my experience today, lots of people I speak to, a lot of people I speak to be pretty optimistic. There'd usually be the upfront caveat. If they happen to know that I was a vicar, they'd probably say something along the lines of, well, Gov, not saying I've been perfect or anything, but then comes the sort of note of confidence, but, I've never done anything really bad. And I've often tried to do my best. And God knows that. Me and God, we'd be all right. I've had those sort of conversations on the street a number of times. It is a shock, of course, to be told that something isn't the case when you thought it was. There's the first surprise. This story today is directed at any of us who, perhaps like the Pharisee, trust themselves, trust their own opinion of themselves, and perhaps think that they could twist God's arm in some way. Jesus exposes false assurance right up front. There's the first surprise. Second surprise, misleading appearances of the two characters. Let me just read verse 10 again. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. So you got the highly respected, morally upright Pharisee and the dregs of society tax collector. They stroll into the temple to pray. It would be a little bit like today, a comparison between, a well-dressed, hard-working, frontline NHS worker straight off the night shift, alongside, the other sort of, typical member of society that's not respected, let's say an East End sort of gangster type, grungy looking. Well, if both of these people walked into a Sunday church, I guess if there were people, like us sort of watching, and we had to bet on which one was right in God's eyes, I guess most of us would put our money on the more respectable looking person, somebody who made the cut for heaven. Appearances can be misleading. And it's their prayers, of course, in the parable, it's their prayers that reveal their true colors. Let me just read that bit out again. The Pharisee, verse 11, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. You can imagine him drawing attention to the fact that there is one of these sort of evil, grungy tax collectors nearby. I fast twice a week, the prayer continues. I give tithes of all that I get. Now, do you see the Pharisee's confidence? It's in what he has done, especially in what he has done compared to other people. It turns out this guy thinks pretty highly about himself. The story is told of a small child who's being encouraged to pray by their parent to just thank God for something at the end of the day. Now, the child is particularly grumpy and can't think of anything to thank God for and keeps shaking her head. The parent keeps encouraging, surely there's something, darling, surely something that you could thank God for. Finally, the prayer goes like this from the little girl: thank you, God, for me. That's essentially what the Pharisee does. Thank you, God, for me. And thank you that I'm not like that lot, especially not like that tax collector. Thank you for me. Why did the Pharisee think so highly of himself? Well, because of his law keeping. Verse 12, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Now, fasting twice a week, that was ridiculous. In the Old Testament, the law to which the Pharisee would have referred, fasting was required on the Day of Atonement, once per year. This man fasted 104 times more than God required of him. And in terms of tithing, I mean, the Old Testament, again, specified that certain things were to be tithed. That just means a proportion given back to God. But this man tithed everything, completely over the top, really trying to sort of impress or win favor with what he did. He exceeded what was required. I guess you could say his halo, self-made, was so bright he could have read a book by it. You know what, God, you're pretty lucky to have somebody like me praying to you. As one commentator puts it, he glances at God, but contemplates himself. What a contrast to the tax collector. Verse 13, the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Now, when you prayed in those days, it would have been normal to look up to heaven and to pray. And this man, in contrast to what would have been normal at the time, he hung his head in shame. The beating of his chest, sort of emphasizing his inadequacy. He didn't care about how other people saw him. He certainly wasn't aware or examining the Pharisee, who in the story is standing nearby examining him. He couldn't care less what other people think. He was acutely aware at this point in the story of how God would see him. It's notable, whereas the Pharisee had a list of good things he had done, rules that he had kept, what did the tax collector have? Nothing, just one request. Verse 13, God, be merciful. Now, you only ask for mercy when you know that you deserve a punishment. This man knew that he had fallen short of God's standards. And so he was saying, God, please pardon me. Please forgive me. Give me mercy. A few years back, I walked out of my house and it was the middle of the day, so it was quite a quiet time in the street that I lived in. And I saw a man standing beside a parked car, very close to where I was standing myself. And he had in his hand, he had his back to me, but he had in his hand a large screwdriver. And I could see he was just about to sort of shove it into the lock of the car. I knew quite a lot of the neighbors. I'd never seen him before. It didn't look like he was legitimately trying to get into the car. He was obviously a car thief. I took the opportunity just to sort of swing around 180 degrees, went straight back in the house, called 999. As it happened, the police were very close by. They had a car in the area. They were able to drive up without their sirens, which was very good forward thinking. And two policemen walked out of the car and came right up behind this guy and caught him literally with a screwdriver in the lock of this car. He was convicted. I had to go to court to testify, and he was put behind bars. Now, let's just replay that story. I could have shown mercy. I had the opportunity when I saw him breaking in at that point. I could have given him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I did benefit of the doubt. Imagine if he'd sort of swung round, saw me, and just looked at me remorsefully and said, I'm really sorry. Could have played out really differently. If I'd shown mercy, I wouldn't have given him what he deserved by calling the police. I would have said, yeah, that's fine. We all make mistakes. Something like that. Back in our story, the tax collector, he has no halo, self-made in his own sight, just a realistic self-awareness of how God sees him. And that leads us to the final surprise, the verdict with a twist ending. Verse 14, I tell you, says Jesus, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. Tables are turned. The man you expect to succeed fails, and the expected loser succeeds. The story ends. He went home justified. That means his sinful state was removed. A right status was given. God saw him from that moment as perfect, righteous. End of verse 14, Jesus says, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. God honors the humility of the tax collector, and he condemns the proud boasts of the Pharisee. What a surprise, twist ending. So where does that leave us? Well, the challenge is personal. We're dealing tonight with, I'd like to suggest, the most important question you'll ever have to answer. Will you make the guest list of heaven or not? Many who think they'll get in won't. Remember, getting into heaven, it's not about appearance. It's not about what you do. You remember in Jacques' testimony just now, he said, we bring nothing to the table. He was really convicted by that. We have nothing to offer God. And it's not about what you don't do. We tend as human beings in our sort of natural state before God, we construct a moral scale. It's going to be determined by various influences around us. We construct a moral scale, we draw a line, and we make sure we're on the right side of it. And we say, yep, God will accept me. I'm here. But the story today shows us that this is futile. Making the cut for heaven is about recognizing that the only person's opinion that matters about you is God's. He made you. You belong to him, whether you sort of ever realize that or not. I mean, he made everything in this world, including all of us. And you, like me, we push God naturally out of our lives. That's what the Bible calls sin. There must be a consequence. And when we see that, when we realize that we've lived without reference to God in this world, there's only one right response. The only thing we can do, well, it's like the tax collector. We've just got to say sorry. Please give me mercy, God. Please don't give me what I deserve for pushing you out of my life. I remember when God gave me mercy. That wasn't because he didn't care about justice. You see, I knew I'd done things wrong in God's sight. I knew that I'd lived without reference to him. And God put the punishment that I deserved. It wasn't like he brushed it under the carpet. He placed it on his son, on Jesus. And Jesus took that to the cross and he died. That is the good news of the Christian faith. So, will God let you into heaven? That's the question that Jesus wants the crowd to consider as he finishes this story. The tax collector went home justified. An immediate pardon, right then, right there, perfectly right in God's eyes. You see, you don't have to wait to heaven to find out if you're going to make the cut. The tax collector went home justified that day. This is something you can be sure about today as you ask God for mercy. Well, I hope that's given a few things to think about and maybe to discuss. That's all from me. Tom, back to you.